Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you, Pete. I would like to thank IATP to having invited me to this important meeting beyond the Farm Bill, because I believe from a European point of view we have a lot to share and to discuss regarding our own and respective policy frameworks on both sides on the Atlantic. What I want to explain to us this morning is a little bit more about the process we have experimented in the EU over the last 5 years regarding the EU Farm Bill. It's not a Farm Bill in itself, it's a Common Agricultural Policy, the CAP. And I want to tell you some stuff about our experience to gather civil society movements, NGOs, networks regarding the discussion we had regarding the EU Common Agricultural Policy. So I want to tell you some stuff about first the CAP, our EU Farm Bill, if you prefer. Secondly, some stuff about ARC 2020, Agricultural and Rural Convention, and finally some words about the way we act from ARC 2020 to change and to lobby the Common Agricultural Policy. Just some picture in introduction regarding the main challenges we faced just before the starting point of the CAP reform. Some picture on the bottom, it's a French wording regarding the situation in the farming sector. Le blé caché, blé is wheat, the wheat, but the other sense of wheat is cash money. And the fact is, in the EU, the larger part of the farmers groups involved in the cereals or crop sectors are the winner of the CAP for 20 years. And it raised many problems regarding the distribution of money among farmers. And it faced many challenges regarding the fairness, the equity among the farmers themselves. And on the right side, on the top, it's the way that NGOs are interpreting, this challenge and this struggle between the different stakeholders in the European institution with EU policymakers. It's a picture of the European Parliament in Brussels. So, what are the lessons we can learn from the CAP reform process? So just three slides. The first one is that the CAP is reformed every 7 years. So it's a process that happens oftenly. It starts in the 90s, in 1992 exactly, and we have experimented the 5th reform over the last years. And we know that the CAP reform is following a kind of path dependency and some incremental change. So it means some little changes, but in the same direction for the last reform. Since the 2003 reform, the main change in our EU policy was the introduction of decoupled direct payments. And it means that decoupled direct payments become the main dossier for us. The main dossier, because each year 40 billion euros are spent toward the income support of farmers, and this money represents roughly 70% of the whole CAP expenditure. So this is the crucial issue for us. But in the same time, we face a CAP paradox, because food is not the core of the CAP anymore. The core dossier has become income support for farmers. And just an example, the Less Deprived People program we had for 20 years has moved from the CAP towards the European Social Fund. It means that the schemes for the most deprived people is now interpreted as a social policy and not a food policy. So behind that, the question is about CAP legitimacy. We are paying farmers for doing what? This is the main question for taxpayers' organizations. And at the same time, for many civil society movements, CAP is a very, very boring and complex policy. It's very difficult to attract people, to attract NGOs around these very complex issues. The first one in the 90s were the environmental NGOs, and they were the only one to be involved in such debate apart from the farmers' organizations. And since we have experimented a change, since the debate has been enlarged towards new social movement, new networks, and we have more and more people, more and more civil society organizations involved now, 20 years after the first reform. So this is a good signal. The second thing, is the fact that the CAP in itself doesn't perform all the food and farming issues. Some stuff like the geographic indications, the GMOs, pesticides, seeds, organic, trade, commodities regulations, etc., are absent from the CAP package, you know. So some issue like access to land, land grabbing, community support of agriculture, etc., are not very well addressed by the current CAP. So CAP has a sectoral approach. We have to face with that. And that's why the CAP is also under criticism, because it is not fit for the time for some people. And at the beginning of the debate of the last CAP reform in the 2006 and 2008 era, some voices have called to scrap the CAP directly, not to reform, but to scrap directly the CAP, especially from the UK and the Nordic countries of Europe. So the question is, food and farming policy for everyone, is it possible to work on that? And we have to face that it's more easier for people and for NGOs to fight against something they refuse, like GMOs, like land grabbing, etc., etc. But it's very, very difficult to engage people, to embark a lot of NGOs to fight for another narrative, for another CAP or another family, I don't know. So it's the key question. If we are able to embark people for an alternative narrative or an alternative CAP, in which direction? Third, the last lesson we learned from the different CAP reform process is about three important facts. The first one is regarding the policy-making process we have in Europe, the key role of the European Union Commissioner for Agriculture and Rural Development. We have experimented 5 reforms, and the fact is the profile, the personality of the EU Commissioner for Agriculture and Rural Development is a key thing, because this is the first guy who drafts the proposals and send the proposal to the ministers, to the members of the parliament, and to the different stakeholders, including the farming sector and the NGO. So it's important to have this target in mind and to feed as soon as possible the EU Commissioner with fresh proposals. The second fact is the increasing role of the medias and the journalists, because we also have experimented at the beginning of the 2000 years some problems in the food and farming sectors. For instance, the mad cow disease, food safety problems that had no direct links to the CAP, but for psychological reasons, they had a huge impact on the CAP beyond that. So for many observers, medias, we had to review the EU policy framework for food and farming. And the third one is about, and yes, and that's why, sorry, I forgot one thing. It's for the media, that's why it's important to explain in detail how the CAP works and to try to explain the CAP for the dummies. That's why we try to make some materials, proposals to explain how it works. It's important for us, for our own community, for NGOs, but also for the media, for the journalists, for the foundations, etc., etc. Otherwise, it's difficult to embark more people with us. And the third one, indeed, is the increasing role of NGOs for 20 years, especially the role of environmental NGOs first in the 90s, then the development NGOs, and progressively more and more sectoral NGOs and networks like rural development ones. So, from this fact, it's important to reinforce the civil society participation and to reinforce the capacity building. So why did we need a new CAP? First, we believe the CAP could be an opportunity to make changes possible towards a more sustainable food and farming systems. And from a strategical point of view, to put a foot into the door. To put a foot into the door. Why? Because we believe we could defend and we could promote an alternative narrative, what we call a sufficiency narrative. A sufficiency narrative is a narrative where we don't have to expand the production to feed the world. The challenge is to share differently the resources in our respective communities. So it's about, regarding, for instance, the food challenge, the hunger challenge, the response is not to expand the production in the world, but to share differently, to review our food patterns, to review the food diets, etc., etc. This is what we have called in the EU the sufficiency narrative, to produce enough, but with less resources, and especially natural resources. And what's wrong with the CAP? Some problems as follow. First, the unfair and blind distribution of money among farmers. I suppose it's the same in the US probably. Volatile prices and lack of market management. Public goods are not very well taken into account, environmental public goods. Rural development is in a corner in our own CAP, because rural development is 20% of the whole budget of the CAP. And then nutrition and access to food is out. It's out of the picture, it's out of the CAP. It's now within a European social policy. So what is ARC? ARC is not the agricultural risk coverage you have in the farm bill right now. It's the agricultural and rural convention. Basically, it's a civil society platform we launched 5 years ago. ARC in itself is not an organization, it's a process. It's a process, it's a platform aiming at facilitate the debate among NGOs for better food and farming systems. We launched for that an innovative and transparent process. I will talk about the communication we launched. It's not an entity as we don't have any membership, but we invite each network, each NGO to commit themselves in the ARC network and to make proposals for change in different policy areas. We have launched it in 2010, just before the EU policymakers, the EU Commission, opened the debate with its own communication. That's why we have drafted collectively with more than 150 NGO representatives, a communication to the EU institution, a kind of blueprint of what kind of CAP we want for the future toward 2020. And this kind of process has been initiated by two organizations in the EU. First is the Groupe de Bruges. It's a EU think tank. I am a member of the board. And then Forum Synergie, which is a rural development network. And then we have engaged new stakeholders and new EU NGOs. So for instance, we have so far Friend of the Earth Europe, Pesticide Action Network, the IFOAM group, EU group, Slow Food, European Milk Board, the European Public Health Alliance, APRODEF, this is a development NGO, and national platform from France, Germany, etc., etc. And why did we need an agricultural animal convention? Because we were convinced it was important to gather a range of diverse civil society movements, because often EU policymakers face too many diverse, too many sectoral messages, and it's a lot. And for some EU policymakers, it's a lot, and it leads to a confusion. Because you have more and more stakeholders involved. Some want to defend the farmers, the other the workers, the other the environment, the other the butterfly, the local food systems, the rural networkers, etc., etc. So you have a large shopping list, which is difficult to integrate and to digest for the EU policymakers. So the main idea was to make a common work among with EU NGOs with a flexible approach, and to discuss key messages around this communication. And it was important also to reflect the diversity of each sectoral family, community, farmers' organizations. We cannot talk about the future of the EU CAP without the farmers' organization, so it's a question of credibility, legitimacy for NGOs, farmers' organizations, environmental organizations, development organizations, public health organizations, and more local food systems organizations, etc., etc. So in the end, we have embarked more than 150 EU organizations signing this communication to the European institution. This is a photo of the process we have experimented, of the convention itself, to agree on a joint statement. And then it's important for us, it was important to identify different stages of the process, of the CAP process, because it was a long process. You know, the beginning of the process of the CAP reform has started in 2008. And right now, today, it's not over. It's not over. So it's a long process, very long. So we have identified at least three key stages. The first one was the early lobbying towards the European Commission before the Commission sent its proposal. It's a key stage for ideas. The second one was to enlarge the scope of the debate towards civil society. That's why we launched in 2012 and 2013 a campaign called Good Food, Good Farming Movement. The idea was to enlarge the grassroots basis, because so far we had embarked mainly EU-based and Brussels-based NGOs, and the local food movements, for instance, was not embarked. So it was important to talk to the grassroots people, and we launched this campaign with other NGOs and farmers' organizations like Via Campesina, for instance. And third, the final round, 2013 and 2014, was to coordinate civil society organizations around joint message in the final round of negotiations among EU policymakers. Our focus was mainly a double focus. First one, to call for a paradigm shift in the food and farming systems, I told you about the sufficiency narrative. It's a key narrative for us. And that's why we have defended agroecological practices, agroecological innovations in both the food and farming sector. 2 weeks ago, with the IFOAM EU group, we have launched this brochure about agroecological innovation within the sufficiency narrative. It's important for us to stick to that. And the second focus is about rural development, and we have called for a rural renaissance. It means for us that rural development is a broader perspective than farming, and farming is part of rural development. Because in the EU, the problem we face is that for many farmers' organizations, rural development is the farmer's business only. But it's not true, it's not the reality. We have to replace the farming business within a broader rural development perspective. So that's why we think it's important to reinforce the rural development pillar we have, and especially the community-led local development concept. So to finish my presentation, some slides about the most concrete actions. Some photos, some pictures is with the EU Commissioner for Agriculture and Rural Development when we give him our communication. We have to remind that at the same time, the EU Commissioner, Dacian Ciolos here, has launched a debate during 3 months. What kind of CAP do you want for the future period beyond 2020? And our 2020 has complemented this debate launched by the EU Commissioner. Our idea was to continue the debate during the end of the CAP negotiation. And our 2020 has used the joint bargaining of civil society organizations across Europe to support civil society statement. And on the bottom, it's another picture in the European Parliament of a joint conference with Slow Food. Secondly, the Good Food and Good Farming campaign. We have organized from August 2012 different marches from different countries, from Spain, south of France, from Germany, from the Netherlands. People with their bicycles, with their tractors, have engaged a long march towards Brussels for a conference at the end of September. And the idea was to, in the same time, was to invite people to send messages, specific and short messages, to policymakers. And we have invited people to take a piece of paper and to write a message in their own language. And within our ARC 2020 staff, we have collecting all those messages across Europe, and we have published all the pictures in newspaper and this kind of books. What EU citizens expect from a common agricultural policy. And finally, during the conference, we have shown all the messages to the EU policymakers on the screen. Third, for the final round of CAP negotiations, at the beginning of last year, we have organized a process called Go Meet a Deputy, Go Mad. Because we felt it was important to include a comprehensive tie and relationship with the MEPs. Because it was the first time the EU MEPs have to co-decide on the CAP reform. Because before, the EU MEPs was only not a co-decision power, but an opinion to send to the Ag Minister. But for the first time here, the MEPs have a co-decision power. So for civil society organization, EU citizens vote for their MEPs. So we have encouraged people to meet the MEPs about the CAP reform. So we are coordinating a range of meetings across Europe, personal meetings, collective meetings in their constituency or in their office. And finally, we have organized a festive gathering in front of the seat of the Parliament in Brussels the day before the vote in March 2013. Our idea was to influence the votes regarding some key questions, for instance, the distribution of money, capping of money for larger farms, etc., etc. So it was a great experience. You have the photo on the bottom in Strasbourg, the seat of the Parliament. And finally, because it's a complex EU policy-making process, we have organized at the end of June an event for ag ministers, to target ag ministers. And we have organized some actions to tell our politicians, don't cheat your citizens. You know, it's kind of actions with banners, and we have introduced people inside the Ag Council ministers to send some specific message regarding the CAP reform. My last one. I told you the CAP reform is not over because it's a long process. And regarding maybe some parallel conversation we could have with the US, the fact is, if the Common Agricultural Policy has been reformed last year, in reality, as we have a more complex EU policy making process, we have more and more member states within the European Union. We have 28 member states. It's more and more difficult to reach common agreements at EU level. That's why we face a process, what we have called a de-Europeanization of the CAP. It's not a renationalization because the money expenditures, the common market remains at EU level, but we have more flexibilities. Member states have more flexibilities to adapt at national or regional level the EU deal. That's why, in theory, each member state has the possibility to improve the EU deal, but reversely, they have the capacity to not improve it. So that's why it's important from a civil society perspective to inform, continue to inform people, NGOs, about the leverage, the room for maneuver. How is it possible to continue? That's why we have launched from last summer a kind of toolkit to inform the members and people in member states how can we improve the CAP reform. But it's not over. I have to stop right now. It's not over, but because next week and in the next 2 weeks, we will have important votes in the European Parliament regarding the implementation of this new policy. So let's see. To conclude, as I said before, the CAP reform is one thing, but the CAP in itself cannot cover all the food and farming issue area. 2 years ago, the European Environmental Agency has launched a project. It's a kind of reflexive process to say, well, we have to have a look beyond the CAP. Because the CAP is only one piece of the puzzle. You know, you have the environmental acquis, the regulations, etc. You have the CAP in itself, but beyond the CAP, how to deal with the food system, to want a more sustainable food system. How to deal beyond that for a greener economy, etc., etc. So this is the next challenge for us, collectively, to extend the scope just beyond the CAP, and to have a broader platform just beyond this specific policy area. Thank you for your attention, and let's continue.
Thank you, Sylvain. We have some time now to have a few questions. There's some microphones from like yesterday that are roving. So if you have a question for Samuel, put your hand up and he'll.
And thank you for this presentation. Thank you for coming all the way over from Europe to join us. I'm just wondering what you think that the possibility of this, the transatlantic partnership will be, and what influence that might have on the CAP and on your work with the CAP.
Thank you for this question. Indeed, the transatlantic negotiations regarding investment, trade, and yes, also the regulatory framework would have a huge impact and probably a negative impact of the CAP reform, indeed. This is a tricky situation where within the European Commission you have one commissioner asking for a CAP reform, for a more sustainable food and farming system in theory, while its neighbor, the trade commissioner, is asking for an ambitious trade and corporate agenda with the US. So from our point of view, there is no coherence within the EU policies. And it's true that the TTIP agenda and its corporate agenda would have a very negative impact on the CAP reform. So that's why we should have a look beyond food and farming policies like the CAP towards more global trade agreements, etc., etc. So this is a great challenge for us ahead, indeed.
Thank you so much, Samuel. And I just want to say that with respect, I disagree with you that CAP is boring. You certainly made it not boring to me, and ARC 2020 has done that too. With regard to the trade agreement, a couple weeks ago there was a big strategy session in Brussels with NGOs. Some of you were there. There were people from ARC 2020, of course, who participate in that platform. And I think that the extent of understanding that people have about the common agricultural policy was extremely important in informing the debates and discussions that we had about the transatlantic trade agreement. So the work that ARC 2020 has been doing on CAP, I think does feed directly into the very strong and ever-growing strength of the anti-transatlantic trade agreement movement that is growing in Europe all the time. I also wanted to just add that the Groupe de Bruges, if you go onto their website, you can actually go into I think a 9 or 10 or 11 module set of lectures on the common agricultural policy that are really informative and very, very helpful. They all have sets of slides with them. You can dip back into it. You can look at different aspects of the CAP. Very accessible, and something that I think if we had on the Farm Bill would be extremely helpful to, as we move along and as we make assumptions about the extent of people's understanding of what is and what is not in the Farm Bill. One of the things that was I found really useful was that this was structured in a way that every lecturer repeated really important parts of the history of the development of the CAP and different CAP reforms. And that repetition and reiteration really made the CAP not boring and really made you understand what the lecturers kept finally referring to as the original sin of the CAP, which was that the CAP didn't really take seriously rural development. And it sat outside early on in the CAP, and that this was kind of an original sin. That led me to think a lot about our Farm Bill and a lot about the history. So Samuel, thank you so much. And the structure of ARC 2020 is so relevant to these meetings. Thank you for coming all the way. It's fantastic.
Thank you. A couple questions here.
I have other sins for the CAP, but in looking at your materials and hearing you, and also I've written about the cap in relation to the Farm Bill. It seems that that your movement has the same flaws our movement has here, from my point of view, which is sort of the historical family farm or the justice aspect of it. So I noticed that there's, as in here in the United States, we have a big, we have a farm subsidy database and a lot of knowledge. And so what people see are the subsidies, and you kind of emphasize that in your thing. You also mentioned market management, but it's sort of like a side issue, as though that's not important. Whereas in the long run, our movement here has said it's all about market management. You don't ever need any subsidies except when you fail to do market management. You're a little different there because we're in the United States and we dominate the market. And so we have chosen to lose money on our exports for a quarter century or 30 years for wheat, for example, in order to try to, by destroying our farmers, to run your farmers out of business. And we've had, you know, a bigger market share, so we set world prices. So you've had to be subservient to the trade war that we started in that regard. You know, I just say, my view is that you're seeing only the little white part, the subsidies above the board, and you're not seeing the reductions caused by the lack of market management. And by the way, I have the same thing on both sides here. Okay, so the little white part on top is like the tip of the iceberg. Okay, I mean, that's the part from the historical family farm movement here that was written about, for example, by Mark Ritchie here at IATP over the years. So here in the United States, we've lost touch with the market management part in our food movement today that we've called for 30, 40, 50 years. They finally got here. They're against cheap prices, but they don't know that this other part below the water exists. But anyway, just be interested in your comment.
Yes, thank you. It's an important question. Indeed, the CAP agenda since the 1992 period is very much focused on subsidies and not on market management anymore. It's a pity because market management instruments to the CAP, it's about roughly 10% of the expenditures. It's nothing. So this is the situation. Less market intervention, less storage measures, less, or at least minimum safety nets for farmers. But this kind of situation is not new, because the WTO agreement 20 years ago, the EU has decided to move forward a more market-oriented policy framework. And according to the OECD and WTO mantra, it's more efficient to pay directly the farmer, to give a check to the farmer to support its income rather than to support the market. This is the trend that the EU has followed. And what is interesting right now is to observe some parallel path between the farm bill and the reform CAP. In the US, the farm bill has been approved at the beginning of February. What is interesting is to learn about the remarks and the comments from the EU side regarding the new farm bill. And those remarks are divided. On one part, you have the official mantra from the European Commission, for instance, saying, well, the new farm bill is not realistic. The new farm bill is out of the WTO agenda and probably will cost a lot for the US taxpayers. This is one opinion. The new farm bill doesn't fit with WTO commitments. And the other reaction, especially from the farming sector in the EU, is to say, well, the farm bill as phasing out its decoupled direct subsidies. They have reinforced the insurance schemes. They have kept some market management for specific commodities. This is a good thing. This is the future for the, probably, we hope, the European farming policy beyond 2020. this is a kind of reaction from the farming sector saying, well, the EU could learn a little bit more from the new farm bill. You know, so you have quite mitigated opinion on your farm bill, and the mainstream opinion is to say, well, the farm bill is fit for the future challenges, while the new CAP is outdated because we have still decoupled direct payment without any links to food production.
Thank you, Tim. It was quite interesting. Appreciated seeing how you've come together. I'm very curious about the mechanisms by which you came to agreement as a coalition of organizations. What are the governance structures, resource sharing agreements? I think that would be instructive for this crew here in trying to understand how to organize for the future about how you at ARC did that.
Well, the first cornerstone was, as I explained, drafting a joint communication for the future of the EU farming policy. In doing that, we spent probably 6 months to prepare that communication. First, we have set up working groups, physical meetings, working groups on the website on specific and sectoral areas. For instance, market management, more sustainable practices, agroecological practices, market competition within the food chain, competition rules, and on the other side, the consumer, the food safety, the health concerns, and then finally the rural development aspects. So a range of 5 or 7 specific package to discuss collectively, thanks to the website and working groups. And in the final stage, we have organized a full day meeting to discuss and to negotiate collectively in the room with more than 150 representatives, to negotiate collectively those proposals. This was the method we have adopted, and once we have adopted this communication, we have proposed to with NGO to continue to work collectively with within a more smaller groups, with a core group with a dozen of EU organizations. But basically, the core was to emphasize on both rural development renaissance. So it means we need more rural development organizations and networks, because the problem in the EU, we don't have any lobby group who defends rural development interests. Rural development interests are defended only by the farming sector, but it's a specific, specific aspect of rural development. So the objective was to expand the rural development basis, and secondly, to expand also the agroecological community. When we talk about a sufficiency narrative, it's important to gather more people around agroecological stuff on the farming side, but also food system side. So this double focus. And around that, it was important for us to gain legitimacy with the good organizations on board.
I think we have time for one more.
Hi there, I'm Kathy Ozer with the National Family Farm Coalition, and appreciated your presentation and also the answers to the questions. And one comment you made during the presentation was how a lot of really important issues are outside the CAP, including the whole issue around genetic engineering and GMOs. And following up on Juliet's comment in terms of what's at stake in the US and for the transatlantic trade agreement, do you have any updates as to how that issue is being addressed through your work, and ways to make sure that some of the good policies that you have in Europe aren't undercut by some of the bad negotiating positions that we unfortunately think will be coming from the US in terms of dismantling some, or pushing to dismantle some of the important laws that are in place. And having been in Brussels and speaking at the stakeholders meeting, the commodity group presence and the pro-biotech and crop life and the pesticide interests were in full force in Brussels, and there were 3 or 4 of us that were countering that message. So appreciate to hear your comments on that.
Yeah, thank you. Basically, ARC 2020 is not a platform aiming at working on GMOs. We have many other platforms, networks across Europe, working on GM. So our aim is not to repeat and to duplicate. But anyway, within the CAP reform agenda, we have identified some key areas where the GMOs question has come back, including within the rural development pillar, the rural development programs. One, new things in our new CAP is the innovation agenda. The innovation agenda is part of the new EU CAP. What does it mean, innovation? Innovation is different meaning, different interpretation according to the different stakeholders. For the mainstream, according to the mainstream interpretation, innovation is bioeconomy. It refers to technological innovations, including biotechnology. But according to NGOs and to our 2020 network, innovation is broader than technological innovation. It's about social innovation, organizational innovation, social learning, etc., etc. And indeed, in a specific part of the new CAP called the European Innovation Partnership, we have negotiated some stuff with the biotech sector and with the EU commissions. And this kind of debate was in itself a discussion, a confrontation between both narratives, the productionist narrative and the sufficiency narrative. And we succeeded in the end, thanks to this negotiation last year, that innovation goes beyond biotech and technological. It's about social, especially for agroecological innovation, etc., etc. And in the end, about GM, seeds, we face different lobby groups like the seeds lobby, the GM lobby, the fertilizer lobby, etc., etc. But in the end, what was important for us is to have, at the EU level, for the EU picture, the two narratives. Productionist narrative, but also the sufficiency narrative. We could have fight, the productionist narrative, but it was more complicated from a strategical point of view. But in the end, we have obtained the sufficiency narrative, yes, is into the EU blueprint, the EU strategic implementation plan.